The funeral home files the death certificate on a Tuesday morning, a routine piece of paperwork required before cremation or burial can even proceed. By Tuesday afternoon, that single document has already started moving through a chain of government databases and private data broker systems most grieving families have never heard of and never think to ask about. By Thursday, a data broker profile that already existed on the surviving spouse, built from years of ordinary public records, quietly refreshes with one new tag attached to it, recently bereaved. That tag doesn't just sit there. It gets sold, bundled into lead lists, and purchased by exactly the kind of people this video is about, sometimes before the funeral itself has even happened. By the time the family gets home from the service itself, exhausted, still absorbing the loss, that signal may have already reached people waiting specifically for it. I want to walk you through this timeline in order, because understanding exactly how fast it moves and exactly which moments along the way are the most dangerous is the single best protection available to any family going through a loss right now. This isn't a hypothetical concern or a rare edge case. It's become organized enough and automated enough that entire categories of scam now specifically target the days surrounding a death, rather than targeting people at random the way most scams do. I'm Henry Collins. Every week on this channel, I break apart exactly how scams work mechanically, so you can recognize them before they cost you money or peace of mind. Today's topic sits in a category I think deserves more attention than it gets, because it targets people at the single moment they're least equipped to think clearly, defensively, or suspiciously about anything at all. Losing someone is hard enough on its own. I don't want anyone watching this to also lose money to a stranger who was simply waiting for the moment it happened. Let's start at the beginning of the actual timeline, because most people assume the exposure starts with the obituary itself, and that's not quite right. It starts earlier, often before a single condolence card has even arrived. The moment a funeral home files a death certificate, that record enters your state's vital record system, and depending on which state you live in, it can become accessible to the public almost immediately. Several states, including Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Massachusetts, and Montana, treat death records as fully public, with essentially no waiting period at all, meaning literally anyone can request one within days of a death being recorded. Other states restrict access to immediate family for a period of years, but even those restricted records still flow out to what's legally defined as interested parties, a category broad enough to include insurance companies, certain licensed data aggregators, and businesses that specialize in exactly this kind of record collection, all of them entitled, under the law, to that same information regardless of how private the family assumed it would remain. Then comes the Social Security piece, which moves even faster and touches every state equally, regardless of local public records rules. Within days of the death, the funeral home reports it to the Social Security Administration, which updates a federal system called the Death Master File. Certified data companies receive updates from that file on a regular weekly basis, meaning a death that happened on a Tuesday can be sitting inside multiple commercial databases, tagged and searchable, before the following week's funeral service even takes place. None of this requires any wrongdoing on anyone's part. It's simply the ordinary, legitimate plumbing of how deaths get recorded and processed across dozens of separate systems, all of it built for entirely legitimate reasons, and all of it equally available to the data brokers and lead list companies that criminals eventually buy from. Within days, the funeral home also reports the death to the Social Security Administration, which updates a federal system called the Death Master File. Certified data companies receive updates from that file on a regular weekly basis, meaning a death that happened on a Tuesday can be sitting inside multiple commercial databases, tagged and searchable, before the following week's funeral service even takes place. Then comes the obituary, and this is the part most families do think about, though usually for the wrong reason. People worry about an obituary revealing too much sentiment, or being too short, or not properly honoring a life. The actual risk is much more specific and much less obvious. Cybersecurity researchers have documented that automated scraping tools monitor obituary websites continuously, pulling names, cities, ages, employers, church affiliations, military service, and family relationships within hours of publication, sometimes faster. None of that scraping requires a human being to sit there reading obituaries all day. It's fully automated, running constantly, feeding directly into the same data broker pipelines the death certificate already triggered days earlier. The obituary doesn't create your exposure from scratch. It accelerates and enriches exposure that was already building in the background, adding the specific human details, who you are, who you're related to, what community you belong to, that make a targeted scam call sound personal and convincing rather than generic. By the end of the first week after a death, in a lot of cases, a surviving spouse or adult child has become measurably easier to find, easier to profile, and easier to convincingly target than they were 7 days earlier, entirely through public and semi-public channels that have nothing to do with anything the family did wrong. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's important. None of what I've just described happens because a family made a mistake. It happens because the systems recording a death were built for legitimate administrative purposes: benefits processing, estate settlement, credit reporting, and criminals have simply learned to ride along on top of that same legitimate infrastructure. Now let's talk about what actually happens once that targeting begins, because the specific scams show up in a fairly predictable handful of forms, and knowing the shape of each one in advance makes them far easier to recognize in the moment. The first, and one of the most aggressive versions currently spreading, is what funeral industry professionals are now calling the casket insurance scam. Here's exactly how it works. A family arranges services with a real, legitimate funeral home. Within days, sometimes while the obituary is still fresh online, someone calls the family claiming to be from that same funeral home's billing office, saying there's an outstanding balance tied to something called casket insurance, and that if it isn't paid immediately, the service itself could be canceled or delayed. The caller often already knows real details: the deceased's name, the approximate service date, sometimes even the name of the actual funeral director assigned to the family, all pulled from the same public obituary the family posted themselves. Families in real cases have been asked to send anywhere from a few hundred to several $1,000s, frequently through a cash payment app, precisely because the family is terrified of anything going wrong with the service for the person they just lost. And terrified feels like an entirely reasonable response to a threat like that, delivered at exactly the worst possible moment to think clearly about it. Here's the fact that ends this scam instantly, the moment you know it. There is no such thing as casket insurance, and no legitimate funeral home will ever call demanding an emergency payment to prevent a service from being canceled. Under federal law, specifically the FTC's funeral rule, every funeral home is required to provide a complete, itemized price list, agreed to and signed by the family before any services are rendered. That agreement, the goods and services contract you sign in person when arrangements are first made, is the entire financial relationship. There's no hidden secondary insurance product sitting behind it, and there's no mechanism by which a funeral home would ever threaten to halt a service already underway over a phone call demanding immediate payment. If you ever receive a call like this, the single move that ends it is hanging up and calling the funeral home back yourself, using the phone number on the paperwork you already signed in person, not any number the caller provides. In real cases where this has happened, funeral homes have confirmed within a single callback that no such request was ever made and no such charge exists. The second version worth knowing about is the debt collector scam, and this one exploits something most people simply don't know about how debt actually works after death. You get a call from someone claiming to represent a collections agency, an insurance company, or even a government office, saying your deceased loved one left behind an unpaid bill, an unfinished loan, or some kind of outstanding tax obligation, and that as next of kin, you're now responsible for settling it, often with pressure to pay immediately through a wire transfer, a gift card, or a reloadable cash card. The same handful of payment methods that show up across nearly every scam I've ever covered on this channel. Here's the truth that dismantles this one completely. In the overwhelming majority of cases, a deceased person's debts are the responsibility of their estate, not their surviving family members personally. There are real exceptions: co-signed loans, jointly held credit accounts, and community property rules in certain states. And those exceptions are worth knowing about if they genuinely apply to your situation. But a stranger calling you out of nowhere, pressuring immediate payment through an untraceable method, is not how any legitimate debt collection process works, regardless of whether the underlying debt is real or invented entirely. The third version has grown rapidly over the past couple of years and specifically exploits how families now share funeral information online. It's the fake Livestream scam, and it works like this. A family, or sometimes a scammer posing as the family, posts what looks like a link to stream the funeral service live for relatives and friends who can't attend in person. Something that's become genuinely common and genuinely useful since the pandemic normalized remote attendance at services of every kind. Except the link, in a growing number of documented cases, isn't a real live stream at all. It's built by scrapers who've pulled the deceased's real name, photo, and service details directly from a public obituary or funeral home website, packaged into a convincing fake page, and sent out to hundreds or even thousands of the deceased's actual Facebook friends and family members. Clicking the Watch Live Now button doesn't open a video. It opens a page demanding credit card information before the stream will supposedly begin. Grieving relatives, distracted, emotional, and genuinely just trying to watch a service they couldn't attend in person, have handed over real payment information to a page that was never connected to the actual funeral at all. Reported losses from this specific version have averaged well over $2,000 per incident in documented cases. And because the scam scales automatically once a template is built, a single operation can target dozens of unrelated families within the same week, using nothing but public obituary listings as raw material. Let me walk you through how several of these pieces came together for a family I'll describe as the Pattersons, since their situation touched 3 of these versions within the same 10 days, which is more common than you'd expect once one scam operation identifies a family as an active target. When Frank Patterson passed away at 79 after a short illness, his wife Diane, still in the earliest days of her own grief, posted a warm, detailed obituary the family had spent an evening writing together at her kitchen table, including his full name, his years of military service, the church they'd attended for decades, and the names of his 3 adult children. All the details that felt, at the time, like an honest and loving tribute to a man who deserved one. Within 4 days, one of those adult children, a daughter named Rachel, received a call claiming to be from the funeral home's billing department, citing Casket insurance and demanding $600 to avoid a delay in the service. The voice on the phone was calm and businesslike, referencing the funeral director by his actual name and mentioning the correct date of the service. Details that made the call feel entirely legitimate in a moment when Rachel had no reason to expect anything but ordinary logistics from the funeral home. She nearly sent it, pulling out her phone to open a payment app before deciding, at the last moment, to call the funeral home directly using the paperwork from her father's own arrangement meeting rather than any number the caller had given her, and learned within 90 seconds that no such charge existed and no one from the funeral home had called her at all. 2 days after that, a different sibling, Frank's son Michael, received a call from someone claiming to represent a collections agency, saying Frank had left behind an unpaid personal loan and that, as next of kin, the family was now responsible for roughly $3,000, with a payment plan option offered right there on the call to make it feel manageable, rather than alarming. He nearly agreed to the arrangement over the phone, already exhausted from handling logistics all week and simply wanting one less thing to worry about, before mentioning it to Diane that evening, who confirmed that no such loan had ever existed in the first place, that Frank's finances had been entirely paid off years before his death, and that even if a debt genuinely had existed, it would have belonged to his estate rather than to any of his children personally. And on the day of the service itself, an aunt attending from out of state, unable to travel due to a health issue, and hoping to watch the service from her living room instead, clicked what she believed was the Livestream link her cousin had shared over text. A link that had actually been generated by scrapers who'd pulled the service details from the funeral home's own public website hours earlier and rebuilt them into a convincing fake page, complete with Frank's real photograph and the real time of the service. She entered her credit card information before her daughter, sitting beside her, stopped her and pointed out that the real funeral home never used a payment page to access a live stream at all, that the actual link the family had shared required nothing more than a single click. None of the Pattersons lost $1 in the end, and I want to be honest about why. Every single one of those near misses was stopped not by suspicion in the moment, since all 3 calls and the fake link were genuinely convincing, but by a single habit repeated 3 separate times, pausing and checking with someone else in the family before acting. Comment down below if your family has ever received a call like any of these in the days surrounding a funeral, because I suspect a lot of you have a story that sounds remarkably close to one of the 3 the Pattersons went through in barely a week and a half. I want to spend a moment on why this particular category of scam works so reliably, because I think it's worth understanding beyond just the individual mechanics. Grief itself is a kind of cognitive fog. Decision-making narrows, urgency feels heightened regardless of whether a real emergency exists, and the instinct to protect a loved one's memory or their final service becomes an incredibly powerful lever for anyone willing to pull it. Scammers aren't guessing at this. Industry professionals who've documented these patterns describe it plainly. Families are more than willing to hand over money in these moments, specifically because they're devastated, embarrassed by the idea of anything going wrong, and simply want the person they lost to be honored properly, without complication, at exactly the moment complications feel unbearable. So here's what actually protects a family through this window, and I want to walk through it in a way that's useful both for planning ahead and for responding if you're in the middle of it right now. Before anything happens, when you're writing an obituary, leave out details that read as sentimental but function as identity fraud ingredients: a full birth date, a mother's maiden name, a specific home address, and consider leaving the exact time of the service out of any fully public posting, since burglars have been known to target homes they know will be empty during a funeral. This isn't about making the tribute feel cold or incomplete. It's about separating what genuinely honors someone from what happens to double as a data broker's shopping list. If you're currently the one handling arrangements, verify any request for payment by calling the funeral home directly, using a number from paperwork you signed in person or from the funeral home's known main line. Never a callback number provided by whoever contacted you. A genuine funeral home will confirm or deny a charge within moments, precisely because their actual billing runs entirely through the itemized contract you already signed. If a caller claims your deceased loved one left behind a debt, don't assume you're personally responsible before verifying it independently, ideally with an estate attorney or simply your own research into your state's rules, since in most circumstances that debt belongs to the estate rather than to you. And legitimate collections processes never rely on wire transfers, gift cards, or reloadable cash cards as a form of payment regardless of whether the debt itself is real. If you're sharing a live stream link for a service, share it directly, by text or a phone call, to the specific people who need it, rather than posting it publicly where it can be scraped and rebuilt into a convincing fake. And if you receive a live stream link from someone else, verify its source before clicking, especially if it asks for payment information before a video ever loads, since no legitimate funeral live stream requires a credit card to simply watch. As soon as you have a death certificate in hand, freeze your deceased loved one's credit through all 3 major credit bureaus, and strongly consider freezing your own as well, since surviving spouses in particular become a specific, documented target once that recently bereaved status attaches to a household. This single action closes off a huge share of the identity fraud angle before it ever has a chance to start. And if you ever do encounter one of these scams, whether or not you lost money, report it. The Federal Trade Commission takes reports directly at reportfraud.ftc.gov, and reports specifically involving a deceased person's identity or a fraudulent debt claim help investigators trace patterns back to the operations running them at scale. The same operations capable of hitting dozens of unrelated families within a single week using nothing but public obituary listings as their starting material. I want to leave you with something a little different than usual, because I think this particular category of scam deserves a different kind of closing thought than most of what I cover on this channel. Every other scam I've walked through involves a stranger exploiting your caution, your trust in an institution, or a moment of ordinary distraction. This one exploits something else entirely: the specific, unguarded vulnerability of grief itself. The exact days when a family should be allowed to simply mourn without also having to run a fraud investigation on every phone call that comes in. I don't think the answer is to approach a loss suspiciously, treating every condolence and every call as a potential threat, since that would rob families of something they need just as badly as protection: the ability to actually grieve without a constant undercurrent of suspicion running through it. I think the answer is much simpler than that, and it's the same thing that protected the Pattersons 3 separate times in 10 days. Before you act on anything urgent during this particular window, tell someone else in the family what you just heard, out loud, before reaching for a phone or a card. Grief narrows your thinking in ways that are completely normal and completely human. The same way exhaustion or fear narrows anyone's thinking, and there's no shame in that narrowing, no failure of judgment in it at all. A second person, standing one step outside that fog, even someone dealing with their own version of the same grief, is very often the only thing standing between a family and a stranger who was simply waiting for the moment it happened. Rachel, Michael, and Diane's sister all did the exact same thing in 3 completely different moments that week. Not because they were suspicious by nature, but because grief, as isolating as it feels, is also one of the only times in life when leaning on someone else for a second opinion feels entirely natural. That instinct, already built into how families support each other through a loss, turns out to be exactly the same instinct that stops this particular category of scam cold every single time it's actually used. I'm Henry Collins. Thank you for listening.